Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 6 stories ranging from lost media to haunted houses and much, much more. I hope you all enjoy it. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's see if we can reach 1100 likes on this video. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. I post content just like this every 5 days. Enjoy the video. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. All throughout Canada, a sizable handful of older folks claim to have seen a show titled The Big Room. At least, that's the most common title people use. Other people remember it being called In the Big Room, or A Big Room, or some variation of those titles. Here are the accounts I've collected from people who've talked about it. Supposedly, the first known record of this show was in Toronto in the early 1950s, and the last known record was in Vancouver in the early 1980s. It never aired on any one specific TV station, but would instead air on random stations depending on the date, and would only be broadcast on one or a few specific TVs at a time. Every single episode of the show was in black and white, even after the majority of the country had switched to color. What was the show about? Most testimonies agree it consisted of a large cast of characters getting into silly antics in a large room. No 2 episodes would have the exact same characters, but supposedly the cast consisted of a mix of puppets and people in costumes. Reports of the cast themselves vary, but the most consistent descriptions include a woman with a cartoonishly large nose, a person in a rubber cow mask who spoke entirely in mooing, a monkey puppet with gross human teeth, a person in an unsettling white rabbit costume, a man whose face was a smooth white mask with 2 black eyes and a smiling black mouth, a bird-like puppet with messy feathers, and the disembodied talking head of a teenage girl mounted on the wall like a stuffed deer. Due to the presence of Japanese text in some episodes, some speculated the show was of Japanese origin, though this was never confirmed. It's also worth noting that the show had only been viewed by children, and never by adults or teens. None of the reported viewers had been over the age of 12 when they had watched it. But what makes this show so infamous, and why so many people talk about it despite there being no footage or evidence of it existing, is the ending of each episode. At the end of each episode, the cast would all turn to the camera and thank the viewers, and then they would name drop the specific person watching right now. If there was more than one person in the room, the cast would mention all of their names too. Some children were frightened by this. Others found it flattering, and didn't realize the horror of the situation until they had grown up. I first heard about this show from my mother when she was telling me about some of the shows she watched back when she was a child in the 70s. I didn't think too much of The Big Room at the time. Sure, it was a little weird that the show somehow knew the name of my mom and her brother, but it must have just been a weird coincidence, or the result of distorted memories. It wasn't until I decided to look the show up out of curiosity that I started to become weirded out. There was no IMDb or Wikipedia page for the show, and CBC had no mention of it on any of their sites. I did, however, find a very compelling forum thread about it, so I immediately clicked. The thread was mostly filled with younger people closer to my age who had heard about the show from their older relatives, though there were a few older users who claimed to have seen it themselves. The more I read through the thread and learned about the show, the more interested I became. That was half a year ago. And ever since then, I've been asking around, both online and in person, to see if I can find anyone else who's seen the show, or knows someone who's seen it. A lot of people I spoke to insisted this show wasn't real, and that it was the result of a bunch of collective false memories, or maybe even an elaborate ARG. But I still believed in it. Even if there was no evidence of this show anywhere, surely there were too many eyewitness testimonies out there to write it off as a hoax, right? I've always had a thing for lost media, and this was one of the most fascinating examples I knew of. My biggest breakthrough came when I spoke to Aaron, one of my closest friends, about it. We were chatting over at our local coffee shop, and I decided to tell her about my search for the big room. As I described what I heard about the show to her, she just kind of casually nodded for the most part, but as soon as I mentioned the part with the cow mask, Erin's eyes flew open and her lower jaw dropped. "Holy shit," Erin said. "My dad mentioned having an aunt who wore a cow mask and worked on a kids show, and I completely forgot about it until now." We didn't hesitate. Erin drove me right over to her parents' house to speak to her father, Paul. Erin told her father that I wanted to know more about that aunt who wore the cow mask. He wondered why I was so curious about that weird old memory, but decided it wouldn't hurt to ask about it anyway. Paul explained that he knew very little about this aunt of his, and didn't even remember her name. He heard she worked on a kids show, but didn't know what the show was called, and never saw any episodes of it. The aunt very rarely came over to their house, never more than once a year, but when she did, she was always insistent on wearing that cow mask, so he had no idea what her face looked like, and she never, ever spoke, instead making mooing sounds. He always thought she was weird, but usually didn't think much about her between each visit. Paul then told me his aunt passed away in the early 80s, which I realized conveniently lined up with when the big room was last seen. After she died, Paul's family was given the aunt's cow mask by the coroners, and they've kept it in a box in the closet ever since. I began to quiver with excitement. My friend's family actually had a prop from the long-lost kids show I was looking for. I politely asked if I could see it. He said yes. In fact, I could keep it. He had no use for that old cow mask anymore. I couldn't thank Paul enough. As soon as he handed me the box, I grabbed it from him and continued to thank him even after I walked out the front door. On the drive home, Erin congratulated me on my find, then told me that she had an appointment today, and unfortunately wouldn't be there to open the box with me. However, she said I could send her photos, since she was just as curious to see it as I was. I promised I would. Before thanking her, she dropped me off at my house and drove away. In my bedroom, I opened up the box and pulled out the item inside, an ordinary-looking rubber cow mask that was in surprisingly good condition for something that had apparently been created back in the 50s. I turned the mask over in my hands a few times as my excitement slowly waned. I couldn't help but wonder if this prop was legit or not. There was nothing to confirm it wasn't just a generic cow mask bought from a local store recently. Maybe Erin and her father were just playing some kind of prank on me. If it was a prank, then it was an unbelievably elaborate one, given that Erin didn't even seem to know about the show before I told her. And there would have been no way for her to tell her father in the time she drove me to the house. I took a few photos of the mask from different angles, promising myself to send them to Erin and post them online soon. I then decided maybe a photo or two of myself wearing the mask would also be fun to see. I put it on, surprised by how comfortable it was for something so old and cheap looking. After taking a few selfies from both the front and side, I reached up to pull the mask off my face, but it wouldn't budge. For some reason, the mask felt a lot tighter on my skin and a lot warmer than when I had first put it on. The harder I tugged with both hands, the more it hurt, as if I was pulling on my own skin instead of a rubber covering. I began to panic and hyperventilate as the mask heated up more and more until it felt like I had a fever. The room began to sway as I felt dizzy and nauseous. I wanted to vomit before realizing that would make things worse. Sweat formed on my skin, and my face began to itch like crazy, but the mask prevented me from scratching or wiping the sweat away. I grabbed my phone and desperately began to text Aaron for help. However, the phone began to ring while I was in the middle of typing the message. It said the call was from the big room, even though I didn't have that number anywhere in my contacts. I answered it anyway, just out of curiosity. "Hi, Kelly," said a male voice that sounded pre-recorded. My hands trembled, and I felt like puking again. How did this man know my name? The voice continued. "We're really happy to have you as part of the big room. We unfortunately had to end the show a long time ago after one of our favorite cast members, Miss Moo, the cow lady, passed away. However, now that you've agreed to become the new Miss Moo, we can safely say that our show will now be resuming production very soon. And don't worry about your friend Erin. We'll find a part for her as well. We'll be coming over tonight to pick you up. Until then, moo your heart away, Kelly." As soon as the message ended, the caller hung up. I was terrified and confused. I had a million questions dancing through my brain. What the hell is going on? I screamed out loud to no one in particular. At least, that's what I tried to say. All that came out was a loud mooing sound. Do you know what a tumor smells like? Oranges. Not ripe ones. Rotten. The type you bite into and immediately regret it. I realized there was something not quite right with me when I smelled oranges on my kindergarten teacher. I made sure to tell her every day. I'd walk in and catch the same stink in the air. Miss Weller was in her mid-30s and always greeted me with a bright smile. When she opened her arms to pull me into a hug like every other morning, the smell was intoxicating, and when I wrinkled my nose and tried to sniff it out and find the source of rotten oranges, it hit me that it was Miss Weller's head that smelled, not her hair. Her hair always smelled of lavender and strawberries. No, it was what was inside my kindergarten teacher's head, right inside her skull. I knew something was wrong. I told her one day. When the other kids were playing in the playground, I ran over to where she was bent over her flower garden, planting roses, and smiled widely. "Your head smells of bad oranges," I said, and Miss Weller looked shocked for a moment before laughing it off and telling me to go and play. "But you do," I said. "You smell of bad oranges." The teacher settled me with a smile. "Well, I haven't had any oranges. What do you mean, Mina?" I didn't know what to say, because how was I supposed to describe it? "You just smell," I whispered. A few months later, Miss Weller stopped coming to school, and I learned from listening in on my parents' hissed conversation that my kindergarten teacher was very sick. It wasn't long before she passed, and her flower garden was abandoned. I still went there to see if I could still smell the rotten oranges, but the only smells were the roses and lavender planted for her. I guess I should preface this by saying I've had a strange sense of smell my whole life. When I was 14, I was sitting in my middle school cafeteria talking to my friends when I was attacked with the sudden aroma of chicken, which was so potent in my nose and throat, I thought I was going to throw up. I didn't, thankfully. But Olivia Lennox, who had been sitting across the table from me, suddenly choked on a chicken drumstick. I remember her body face down on the table in a halo of willowy blonde hair, as Mrs. Michaels attempted the Heimlich maneuver in CPR to a lunch full of traumatized kids. We were all expecting the chicken bone to fly out of Olivia's mouth like in the movies, but when Olivia Lennox stopped making spluttering noises, and the teacher pressed her ear to the girl's light pink t-shirt before jumping up and telling us all to stand back, I knew she was gone. Olivia had been talking about summer vacation before she died. She was excited to go to Italy. Reality is different from the movies. It's a whole lot more cruel. When people are destined to die, they actually die. The end. I bet you wish you had a way to know when your time is up. People see it as a blessing so they can complete their bucket list and enjoy life to the fullest. When it's not your date, however, it's different. I suddenly had the power to know how strangers and loved ones were going to die just by the smell coming off of them. And yet my own death was a mystery. It made me wonder if I was dying too. Maybe I was connected with recently dead souls, as well as souls who were going to die soon. But according to my doctor's checks, I was healthy. There was nothing wrong with me, so what was happening to me? The sense I caught didn't always match how someone was going to die. Olivia was a rare occasion when it actually did. It didn't happen all the time. I managed to live a fairly normal life up until my teenagehood. People die and it's normal. That's what I thought to myself, at least. After I caught the smell of popcorn and caramel when I walked past a little girl, or on the way home from school when the mailman greeted me with a smile, and I was suffocated with the smell of moldy cheese. I never saw a countdown or a time limit, or anything to suggest when people would die. I just knew they were going to. The mailman's death was in the newspaper several days later. He'd been struck by a drunk driver and killed instantly. As for the little girl, 6-year-old Ellie Chambers had drowned in the local swimming pool. I couldn't do anything about them. I considered it, but then I realized how crazy I'd sound if I ran up to some random person and told them they were going to die. Not just that, but I knew from their smell I'd be labeled crazy. I learned to ignore it. As selfish as that sounds, I finished high school with decent grades and planned to go to college. I didn't exactly have specific goals or a college or a major. I guess I was winging it. I wanted to see the world and distract myself from the suffocating smells. I was at our senior bonfire when I first got the whiff of gas. I was maybe 2 beers down and was already feeling it. We were all sitting around a raging fire and drunkenly singing and exchanging memories from our 4 years at Bellevue High School. When I smelled it again, it was suffocating. A sharp, intense stink turning my stomach. I was suddenly all too aware of my classmates around me. Their faces lit up in orange, wide smiles and glazed over eyes. I panicked. I mean, anyone else would panic if they had the same sense of smell. I jumped up from where I'd been sandwiched between my best friend and boyfriend, and stumbled over to the cooler of drinks, grabbing bottles of water. The others didn't seem to notice me, enveloped in some story one of the cheerleaders was telling everyone. The smell was ready to turn over my stomach, and I was swallowing down the taste of beer creeping back up. I doused the fire with trembling hands, and I didn't stop pouring water into flickering orange flame until a warm hand was wrapped around my wrist. Mina? My boyfriend's voice was white noise compared to the screech in my head. I didn't notice I was crying until the empty bottle of water slipped from my hands. I waited for someone to die. I waited for one of the cheerleaders to trip and fall, or a guy to start vomiting blood, but nothing happened. I was led back to my seat and I was trembling. The fire hadn't been completely put out, but some kids were complaining, jumping to their feet and announcing they were going to get firewood. I kept to myself for the rest of the night, waiting for a death, and when one didn't come, I found myself filled with both confusion and relief. On the way home, I fell in and out of sleep, my head bumping the window of my best friend's car. The radio was playing mellow pop songs, and my friends were talking about college admissions and a movie recently released they wanted to go and see. I remember joining in the conversation, laughing along with them, and reveling in the relief flooding me. Nobody was dead. I'd caught the scent of someone who was going to die, and I made sure to count everyone in our class before I left. They were all there, all smiling and happy, and definitely not dead, so the question haunted the back of my mind, despite me shaking it off and trying to be positive, trying to believe that I was finally rid of the stupid curse. Who was going to die? As we neared my parents' house, the question wouldn't leave me alone, so much so that I suddenly felt like I was going to be sick. It came over me like a wave of ice water, knocking the breath from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, my chest heaving, my heart in my throat. I was lying face down in the back of my friend's car when she jumped in the back and wrapped her arms around me in a hug so tight, I thought my heart was going to burst out of my chest. In the corner of my eye, I saw flashes. Blue and red flashes blurring into one. My friend was sobbing into my shoulder, dampening my sweater, but I couldn't concentrate on her words. They weren't fully going in. I heard accident and car, and all of me splintered apart. I'd known it was coming. That was all that went through my mind, that same tumultuous thoughts. It was driving me crazy. I had smelled my mother's death and couldn't stop it. How though? That's what I keep asking myself even today. How could I have known that the smell of gas had equaled my mom wrapping her car around a stop sign? That's the worst thing about whatever this is. It lets me know someone is going to die, and it's up to me to join up the dots. I was through joining up dots after my mom died. I got whiffs of people and stayed the hell out of it. I distanced myself from Dad. I know it wasn't my fault Mom was dead, but I felt responsible knowing I could have stopped it. So, I got out of town at the age of 19. I started college but dropped out 3 months after making friends with a boy called Caleb. He was the oddball in class and kept to himself and his drawings. I asked him to hang out one day, and we ended up going back to his dorm and binging Game of Thrones. He was my first real friend, and really the first person I'd connected with and allowed myself to get close to. I was hanging out in his dorm room helping him pick out sketches for an art competition. Caleb was an amazing artist. We were laughing over something trivial when he leaned over me to grab a brush, and I smelled it again. It wasn't as strong as before, more of a hint when I inhaled deeply to make sure. Rotten oranges. The aroma brought back memories of flower gardens and a sweet woman's smile. I couldn't go through that again. Not with Caleb. Stupid Caleb with his dorky grin and obsession with Studio Ghibli movies. I dropped out of college the second I left his dorm. That rancid smell following me. I made sure to text him to see a doctor, and then I deleted and blocked him. I know it sounds cruel. It is cruel. But you have to understand I can't bear to be around people I know are dying and can't stop it. I don't know how to stop it. Even if Caleb gets help and somehow survived it, the smell doesn't go away. I like to think because the smell wasn't as potent, maybe there was a chance Caleb could have survived. I've never had the heart to check after abandoning him. So here I am 5 years later. I moved to the city and got an apartment. Not exactly 5 stars, but it works. You're here for the title, so I'll get to the meat of it. Please bear in mind I will be changing the names of everyone mentioned to the characters in Bram Stoker's Dracula, because I can't think of aliases, and I really don't want to reveal names. I'm not the best at social interactions, so when a work friend dragged me to a random party without specifying it was a party, she called it Gathering of Talented People, which I could understand since we were in the capital. Well known for talented people or pretentious art students who live off of daddy's buck. Anyway, the party was in some warehouse apartment which was on the shadier side of the city, so naturally, I started to get wary in the Uber ride there. I hadn't spoken for most of the ride, more interested in my Duolingo lesson. I was on a 4-week streak. Where exactly is this party? I leaned over to my friend Calliope, shouting into her ear over the screamo on the radio. Luckily, she wore enough perfume to drown out the scent she might be harboring. I'd initially been cold to her when we first met. I didn't want to get attached to anyone. Calliope, however, had a certain charm, an energy I couldn't say no to. She absorbed all positive energy, and most of the time she drives me mad, but I love her. Unlike me, she was an actual college student and worked part-time at the antique store I'd found solace. There were almost no customers, and the people who did come in were either rich kids looking for something sparkly, or middle-aged women with insane stories to tell. The kinds of stories I could turn into books if I knew how to write properly. Man, the things I've learned. One woman once told me she was abducted by aliens who used her blood for glue. She was completely serious. Relax. Calliope was already high, flirting with the Uber driver, who was more interested in her cleavage. It's just round the corner. Really? Pressing my face against the window, I squinted into the night. Blurs of colors from passing apartments and clubs dancing in my eyes. The city at night was my favorite. I liked that my thoughts were drowned out by booming music and screaming, and everyone's individual smells came together in an intoxicating mix I couldn't untangle. When the Uber pulled up to a towering apartment building, I knew I'd made a bad decision following Calliope to the so-called gathering. When I jumped out of the car, though, smoothing down my skirt and trying to brush down the frizz in my hair, I noticed very official-looking security guards standing at the door. Calliope grabbed my arm with an excited squeal. See? I told you this was a fun idea. I tipped my head back and frowned at what looked like a rooftop party. That looks like more than a gathering. I shot my friend a skeptical smile. Calliope rolled her eyes. Okay, more than a gathering. You win. But cool, right? Yeah, cool. I nodded. But I was thinking about being in a confined space with strangers who no doubt had sense that I didn't want to know. If I could stay outside, that would be my best bet. Or I could plug my nose. When Calliope waved 2 slips of paper in my face, I had to squint to read the blocky font. Invitations. The 2 of us hurried past the security guards after flashing our invitations. Calliope with a grin, and me waving it in the air awkwardly. When they waved us in, I had to bite back a hiss of excitement. I'd never been to this type of party. Invite only seemed so exclusive. When we were presented with 4 flights of stairs, I started to trudge up them, sticking to Calliope's side as she danced up each step in her heels. I could hear the thrum of music getting progressively louder, shaking the building. Who cares? Calliope was out of breath. She twisted around to grin at me, panting. I scored them from a guy in my English class. He got a ticket for Dua Lipa and gave us them for free. I realized how out of shape I was when I found myself fighting for my breath. Lucky him. She grabbed me and pulled me up the last few steps, the 2 of us dragging ourselves to a wooden door spray painted with graffiti. I expected a more exclusive way in, like a secret passageway, or a what's the password guy behind the door. But it was good enough. I could already smell stale pizza and beer, so it was going well. As long as the party was suffocated in smells I couldn't place, I would be okay. The trick was not seeking out the stink. The door opened, and we crashed through into a rooftop pool party. The crowd already moving under fluorescent lights which danced in my eyes. Music blaring, and it was perfect. The only smells were the overbearing stink of cologne mixed with chlorine from the pool. Calliope nudged me. Mingle. She shouted in my ear before bouncing off to greet a couple of college kids waving colored party cups. I started to follow her but stopped myself. Calliope and her friends were third-year English Lit students. What would we talk about? She had often expressed that her class were pretentious assholes, and I'd seen it in person when a guy who had come to hang out with her, and then proceeded to go on a 3-hour rant about how Midsummer was spiritual and had changed his life. When Calliope had teased him, I thought he'd laugh along and call himself out, but he was completely serious. Unsurprisingly, I glimpsed him among the others surrounding Calliope. Something told me he wouldn't appreciate my lack of knowledge of Ari Aster and A24 movies. I was told to mingle, so I tried. I joined a conversation between two girls who were both talking in Gen Z speak, so I just smiled and nodded and acted like I understood. Moving towards the open bar, I grabbed a drink and found a spot on the side of the pool, dangling my legs in illuminated water rippling over my toes. The smell of chlorine masked everything else, and it was comforting. I watched the party go on around me in a blur of colors and skin enveloping together, and I was content. The pool stayed empty to my confusion. It was warm enough for a midnight swim, and yet I watched girls and guys edge around it like it was filled with poison. If I had a swimsuit and Calliope's confidence, I would have happily dove in. I glimpsed familiar faces swimming around in the crowd, B-list Twitch streamers and YouTubers. The party was pretty chill though. It seemed like everybody knew everybody and were in some artistic profession. I was just happy to inhale pool fumes for the rest of the night. I mean, that's what I thought. After an hour of sitting in the same spot, choking on chlorine and staring at the pool like I was in some crazy trance, I realized my best friend wasn't getting bored. I could vaguely hear her laughing loudly with her friends. I pulled out my phone to check the time and was hit in the face with that bird notification. I closed the app halfway through my Duolingo lesson, and he wasn't happy, sending me urgent notifications. After a quick glance at the time, which was closing on midnight, I trudged through the last 3 questions. I was frowning at the screen, struggling to make out a Japanese phrase when a laugh sounded from behind me. I thought it was at someone else, so I ignored them when they laughed again. Is that Duolingo? The smell of spice and cinnamon suddenly hit me, and I turned to find a guy around my age holding a bright red apple. Not like he was going to eat it, more like he'd brought it to the party as an accessory. The fruit looked good, juicy, and suddenly tempting enough to reach out and snatch it from him. I wasn't sure what to stare at, his face, which I vaguely knew, or the apple. He'd been on TV, or maybe a movie I'd seen. I couldn't place a name though. The guy stood out away from the crowd and brandished a white shirt which clung to him in all the right places. A pair of Ray-Bans pinning back dark brown bedhead. He was hot, and he looked pretty out of it. I didn't know if it was drugs, or maybe he'd taken a nap. Bruises shadowing his eyes. I didn't know what to say except, "What's with the apple?" He raised a brow. "What's with the impromptu Duolingo lesson?" "It's fun," I said, pocketing my phone. "Well, so is holding an apple." I expected him to leave, taking the smell of spices and autumn leaves with him, but instead he hovered awkwardly, still grasping the apple. I figured breaking the ice would be a good idea. Instead of the two of us standing together with him not saying anything, and me choking on his scent. He had a good scent though, like someone had captured the smell of fall, petrichor, and crushed leaves. I racked my brain for a name. "That guy." He smirked. "Oh, that guy? Yeah, I'm that guy. How did you know?" I scrambled to correct myself. "No, I meant... It's Ren," he said, the muscles in his face twitching into a smile. "I can go by that guy too." Ren was a joker, but after the first few awkward jokes which didn't land, he grabbed a seat next to me and talked about everything from his favorite video games to the time he'd gotten food poisoning from bad shellfish. He was the type of guy who could keep you embroiled in a story which wasn't going anywhere, or a joke which had died halfway through because he was too busy laughing to properly tell it. An extrovert at his prime. Ren was choking on whatever cocktail he'd grabbed to drink, halfway through telling me about his childhood dog when a shadow suddenly loomed over the two of us. Ren glanced up, his mouth curved around the straw in his drink. There was a girl hovering over us looking less than impressed. In her hand was a drink, and at first I thought she was going to throw it over him, but she took a delicate sip from the straw, offering me an awkward smile. She was beautiful. And I mean beautiful and didn't have to try. She wasn't wearing anything special, a low-cut t-shirt over shorts, and yet flaunted them effortlessly. When I drank her in, she looked half asleep, blinking at Ren through half-lidded eyes. She had bed hair too, a crown of dark curls framing her face. The girl had the faint smell of mint. Nothing bad, just toothpaste, I think. Are you an idiot? She reached out and grabbed Ren's wrist, pulling him to his unsteady feet. We've got to go, now. The girl had an urgency in her tone, and from the sudden look in Ren's eyes, like he was waking up from a trance, he nodded. Right. Fuck. Are we good? To my confusion, he tipped his head back, his gaze going to the sky. What time is it? Nearly midnight. She said in a hiss of breath, and nearly totality. Her perfectly made-up eyes narrowed. Where's the apple? My gaze went to the bar. She was right. The apple had disappeared. Fuck, he hissed. This isn't good. Ren turned a shade of white I didn't know existed, his eyes skating the horizon. I followed his gaze to the pitch-black sky. It was a starless night, a half-moon poking from the clouds. Is everything okay? I stood up, swaying slightly. Maybe it was the drinks I'd downed while talking to him, or social butterflies were contagious. Ren scoffed, pinching the skin between his brow. Oh man, don't even ask. Dude. The girl hit him with a scowl, though from the look in her eyes it was teasing. Can't we just stay here? Leaning against the bar, Ren groaned, and I noticed his expression relax once more. We've got like 5 minutes. The girl shot him dagger eyes, before her gaze flicked to me. He's got a thing. I mean, we have a thing. And this thing, it's important. No. Ren crossed his arms. We don't have a thing, Luce. The girl, or Luce, rolled her eyes. Right, my mistake. He has a thing which isn't with me. You really have a way with words. And you're 3.5 minutes away from being screwed. Luce glanced at a fancy watch on her arm. Wait, no. 2.5 minutes. You don't have to count down. I told you this was a bad idea. She gritted out. But nobody ever listens to me. I said no parties. Relax, we're going. Who are you, my mom? The two of them fell into hissed whispering, and I glimpsed a bright red apple poking from her Louis Vuitton bag. So, these guys really liked their apples. In the end, Luce dragged him away. I followed, uncertainly, stumbling over myself. Are you guys good? I had to shout over the music. I shoved past partygoers, suddenly mesmerized in Ren and Luce's business. Yeah, Ren nodded, but he kept nodding. Like nodding would make everything better. He seemed fidgety and paranoid. Suddenly his gaze snapping from the sky to the pool and back again. Luce pulled him back into the crowd, the two of them blending in with dancing bodies. It was nice meeting you. he shouted, yelping when Luce yanked him. Mina, right? Yeah. I was about to ask for his number, but he'd gone. The two of them swallowed into the dark. When I was left standing on the edge of the pool, my eyes found the sky once more. Slivers of white light bathing the clouds as a full moon slipped into view. I found myself transfixed by the sight, before warm arms wrapped around me, beer breath tickling my ear in a curled slur. What's the number for Chinese takeout again? Calliope, whispering sweet nothings into my ear. I spent an hour that night in my bathroom, rubbing my best friend's back as she heaved up everything she'd eaten, mixed with a cocktail of vodka and beer. I let her crash on the couch and jumped into my own bed with a spinning head. I don't remember sleeping, only waking up at 10 a.m. to sunlight pouring through my windows, and the smell of pancakes. Calliope was a good cook, especially when she was hungover. I scarfed down pancakes and headed to work. I'd only gotten maybe 2 feet out of the door before a Starbucks latte was shoved into my face, and behind that latte was a disheveled-looking Ren. He was still in the same clothes, crumpled and torn at the bottom, a checkered jacket slung over his shoulder. This time his Ray-Bans covered what I had to guess were bloodshot eyes from either drugs, or drink, or both. "Morning," he said cheerfully, running a free hand through his hair. I noticed he wasn't alone, 2 figures standing close by. I recognized Luce's hair, though the other person was a mystery. Hesitantly, I took the coffee with a smile. It was still warm. "You know where I live?" Oh, yeah, you told me last night." I was pretty sure I didn't. Maybe I did. The night was kind of a blur. Early morning coffee became the norm. Ren brought me coffee every morning, and that turned into a date where both of us were too awkward to speak. A second and third date where we got closer, and before I knew it, I was spending the night at his apartment. I was introduced to his 2 friends, Luce, who I already sort of knew, and Johnny, the mystery guy. Looks-wise, he was opposite of Ren, short and stocky. While Ren's attributes were a sharp jawline, Johnny had a baby face, freckles dotting his cheeks, and a liking for baggy clothes. The 3 of them had a friendship, or a connection, I guess, that I didn't really understand. They didn't fit as a friend group, at least that's what I thought initially. Ren was the extrovert, always loud and joking around, while Johnny spent his time on his phone or listening to music, hiding under his hood. Luce was a mixture of the two. Sometimes she was loud and overly passionate, especially about musical soundtracks, but she also seemed like a dreamer, often caught in her own thoughts. The 3 of them were a good distraction from my usual dilemma: smells. Though, as I got to know them, I realized there was something strange about them. I noticed Ren's room was weirdly empty, and his luggage was always packed in the back of his closet like he was ready to go somewhere. But he never did. I figured it was because he was traveling for work, but he never used it. Things started to get really weird a few weeks back. We went to a party, some fancy influencer party Johnny had been invited to, and it was pretty fun. I drank and talked to people like the usual party crap. Just didn't think anyone was out of the ordinary until I walked in on Ren closing the blinds, Johnny holding duct tape, and Luce sticking tape over the windows. I'd heard their hissed whispers, domineered by Luce, her voice muffled with the roll of duct tape in her mouth. "What exactly do we do when someone walks in?" Ren climbed onto the counter and reached out, pulling the blinds closed. "They're all probably too high to realize. It's just for a few hours." "Because you insisted it would rain." Johnny, from his place sitting on the counter, his feet dangling, said with a sardonic smile. He grabbed an apple from a gold-plated fruit bowl and took a bite. "And look," he said through a mouthful, Clear skies, and we're stuck until sunrise. Johnny slipped on his Ray-Bans and leaned back, kicking his legs. He whistled. Fuck. They're really trying hard tonight. The bastard is strong. I backed away before they noticed me. Instances like that kept happening, and I started to wonder if they were scared of the moon. It made sense. They made excuses when I suggested going out on a moonlit night, and Ren always closed the blinds, the windows, and kept silverware, including mirrors and anything with a reflective surface, locked away in a cabinet. When I questioned him, he said it had all been passed down from a grandparent, but I'd seen a Target price on the mirror, and the silverware definitely wasn't rusty enough to be that old. Though, things got weirder. As weeks stretched on, I started to smell burning. I woke up in the middle of the night to the stink of smoke choking the back of my throat, but there was no smoke. There was no flame, only the suffocating stink bleeding into my mind. It was just like the rotten oranges and the smell of gas. It was him. It was all over him, blanketing his body and mind, an ignition taking over him. Ren was burning. It wasn't the usual smell of burning, not what I was used to. The smell suffocated me until I couldn't breathe, raw and slicing. I sensed flesh bubbling and torn from bone, hair singeing from a blackened scalp. I felt it all. The overbearing heat prickle my skin, a silent scream ripping from my mouth. No, not my mouth. His. It's like I could sense him, imagine his body caught in an ignition of orange, flailing arms and clothes slowly catching light in endless fire. The burning didn't stop, it didn't falter. It kept going, scorching him from the inside. Ren, though, was fast asleep. He couldn't smell the smoke, or see the phantom flames. I got out of bed and found the bathroom, dousing myself in cold water. My hands were trembling. I waited for him to die, but he didn't. When I went back to the bedroom, he wasn't in bed. Ren was sitting cross-legged in front of the wall. His eyes were open, but unseeing, as he scratched into the paintwork, his nails dripping red with the force of each stroke. I couldn't move, only watched as he sketched out a very rough drawing of a tree. It was beautiful. A large tree with strange symbols carved into its base. I only recognized what looked like a snake, which he finished with digging his bloody nails in further. When I was finally able to force my limbs into some kind of submission, I took slow steps towards him and found myself staring into pooling black. His eyes? They weren't his eyes. His expression twitched erratically, lips moving in a soundless language I didn't understand. Ren saw the carving the morning after. I know he did, but he ignored it, painting over the scratching. I did manage to get a photo. I'll try to upload it. The next day, Luce showed up at the door. Johnny was behind her, shouldering a backpack, and I caught the scent automatically. Hitting. Burning. They were burning too. I could see it, twisting orange and red, writhing up and down Luce's squirming legs, her endless scream harmonizing with a monstrous wail. Luce said 3 words in a sharp shriek. They found us. They left me without saying a word, but I can still smell them. 5 days have passed, and they're not back yet. The smell is still there, still lingering in a thick fog. It's not just the smell. I can feel something. Something deep inside me telling me that he's going to burn. Every day feels like I'm living in a dream, my thoughts tangled and cloudy. Yesterday I screamed until my chest felt like it was collapsing, blood tainting my nose and lips and running fresh and hot down my chin. It came out of nowhere, a wail that I can still feel twisted inside me, locked into my throat. Every time I open my mouth, I'm afraid it will come out. I'm afraid I'll scream until I'm hollow, until I've lost all my breath. I've tried calling, but their phones are dead. I keep thinking. I've gone over it again and again in my head. They're supposed to die. So, why? Why does it feel different for them? Why does it feel like they're going to burn in an entirely different way? And whatever it is, I can't stop it. Like Miss Weller, my mom, and Caleb. I can't stop it. The police hide many things from the public. As an officer myself, I have been made to hide some truly horrifying stuff away from the public. I will take them all to my grave, but this is a secret I just can't keep. You may have heard a rumor that the police have a special paranormal division for events that require skills outside the normal scope of policing. I heard this rumor too before I joined the force, and asked around to no avail. Nobody knew about it, not even some of the senior officers, so I eventually dropped it, but still felt like there was an element of truth to it. There was a quote I once heard as a boy: "Be hospitable to rumors, for however grotesque they are, they always have some reason for existence." It was a normal day on the force, and I was called in to investigate a break-in at a local residential home on the north side of town. The house was along a quiet residential street. As we drove, lights began to switch on as night approached. Eventually reaching the destination and getting out of the car, we saw it. A large, classic 1900s American house receded from the main path. Back in the day, I'm sure it looked beautiful with its huge porch fit for a family, large bay windows to let plenty of light in, and light blue wooden paneling contrasting beautifully with a dark tiled roof. Now it's just a shadow of what it was. Boarding on the windows, holes on the roof. Part of the porch roof has caved in, making it unwalkable, and the garden leading up to the house is completely overgrown with nettles and weeds. The path leading up to the house is barely walkable as the path has deep cracks making the surface unbalanced, and weeds have begun to grow onto the path. We decided to flip a coin to see who would talk to the neighbors and who would survey the house. I chose heads, which meant I had to talk to the neighbors. I saw my partner turn on his torch and walk the path. Little did I know that would be the last time I saw him. The first neighbor I spoke to was a sweet old lady. She said that the house had been abandoned for years and was falling apart. Her bedroom window faces the house, and she has seen lights on, figures walking around, and loud noises like crying and screaming. She said that the house has a long history of quite disturbing events, one of which was a story about a mother that was found guilty of killing her husband, and their maid with a kitchen knife. The husband was stabbed over 100 times or so, she claimed. Another and more recent incident was how a feral dog had broken in through a window in the living room, killing the babysitter and the 2 children she was looking after. She insisted that the house must be haunted due to all these tragic events, and even claims to have seen the very woman that killed the husband and maid in the windows pacing up and down the halls. I thanked her for the information, which was rather helpful, and moved on. As I walk to the next house, my radio comes to life and nearly makes me shit my pants. "Partner, you there? I've been knocking on the front door, no reply. I see movement inside. I'm going around the back to try there. Over." I responded, "Copy that, over," and moved on. I spoke to a few more neighbors, a delightful couple, and a few not-so-friendly neighbors. It's a mixed bag these days. It's either a nice hello or a spit in the eye. As I make my way back, my radio springs back to life with a frantic voice on the other end. "Need backup immediately. Got a suspect wielding a knife. I've entered through the back door and I'm currently positioned in the kitchen. In front of me in the living room appears to be a tall female, dressed in a white gown, dancing from what looks like it. He said this as if he couldn't believe what he was watching. She is in possession of a large, blood-stained kitchen knife. As I listened to this, it sent chills up my spine. What the hell is going on? 10-4, approaching now, over. I ran up the walkway to the house. As I battled my way through the nettles, my radio sprang to life with a reply. She's moved position, walked out of the living room and into the dining room, moving to get visuals, over. As I approached the front door, I jumped at the sound of a manly scream of terror, followed by 3 loud gunshots which lit up the living room window. In brief orange light, all I could hear after was wet smacking sounds, repeatedly followed by a weird crunching noise. I did not know it then, but after it turns out my partner had been stabbed nearly over 100 times with the same knife he reported. The sounds were the knife butchering his body like it was some type of pincushion. As I approached the front door, to my surprise it was slightly ajar. I pulled out my gun and spoke into my radio. Control, this is Unit 4. An officer's gun has been discharged. We need immediate backup at our location. I waited for confirmation before entering. This is Control. Backup is on standby. Please clear the area before we make the dispatch. What they basically meant is that units are spread thin at the moment. Please confirm what we're up against so we can send the appropriate force like SWAT or K9 units. I enter the building, torch and gun in hand, trembling with fear. Police, come out now with your hands up, otherwise I will shoot. The first thing I noticed when I walked through the large wooden door is that it is bone-chilling cold, making me not want to move. When I breathed, I could see the mist depart my lips. It was a huge contrast to the warm, midsummer temperatures outside. I started to move throughout the house, scouring the rooms. It's just as I thought. Old 50s furniture, dusty with cobwebs, bare wooden floors and ripped up, drooping wallpaper along the walls. It was the perfect scene for a horror movie. As I walked into the living room, I saw what I feared. It was my partner's boots. His body was lying out of sight in the kitchen, and as I moved closer, the body got dragged by something fully into the kitchen. I moved forward, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Show yourself now!" I received from behind me a sinister, childlike laugh causing me to spin around, but nothing was behind me. That was it. I had seen enough and wanted out. I charged for the front door, and when I reached it, I pulled on the handle with all my strength. I felt as if my soul had left my body. The door was jammed shut. I remember my partner saying he got in through a back door, so I run back to the kitchen, and there he was. He was on his back and his face was looking up at the ceiling. Blood was pooling all around him, and his face had this look of sheer fear. It was like a face I'd never seen before. In fact, I didn't know faces could do that. I tried the back door, but no, I couldn't get out. It was also jammed. My head was racing. I should have made the call there and then, but I just wanted to get out and be safe again. I thought it can't get worse than this, but I was so wrong. Hell was about to open its gates. As I walked back into the living room, I was greeted by the sound of a low, guttural snarl. My eyes traced the room, trying to find the source, and there it was. Glowing yellow eyes in the far corner near the window. The part where it was darkest. All I could see were those eyes for a few seconds. Yellow eyes with black slits as pupils. It was followed by a nasty wide row of sharp, pointy teeth, pulling off some sort of demonic smile in between them, a long tongue, drooling with saliva all over the floor. It was at that moment I noticed what it was. A huge, black dog, and it started to walk towards me. I looked at my options of escape around me. The front and the back door were locked and the windows had wood panels covering them. stopping my escape through them. I had no choice. I would have to chance running upstairs and to find cover. I bolted with everything I had, and so did this demonic dog, barking, growling, gnashing as it tried to snap at my heels. I braced for it to sink its huge teeth into my legs, but to my fortune, they did not. I flew upstairs as fast as I could, pulling most of my muscles in my legs. Finally, I ran down the long corridor and dashed into a nearby bedroom, slamming the door behind me, and then throwing my body onto the door. Normally, I moan about being fat, but this time, I was actually grateful as my weight was just enough to hold it off. I stayed against the door a while before I heard the banging end. I saw it as my chance to move some large objects by the door, and did so quickly and without noise. I took a look at the room I was currently in. A small crib was in the corner, rocking slowly back and forth like someone was pushing it. At this point, I had seen a lot worse than a crib moving on its own. What was worse was the dolls that were in the room. There must have been at least 30. A few on the floor covered in cobwebs. Some of the faces had been smashed in, and their clothes ripped and savaged. The rest were on the shelves. Their faces were sad and dead, but their eyes, even though they didn't move, always appeared to be looking straight at you. At this point, I decided to call it in and hope for some backup. Control, this is Unit 4. Control, I repeat, this is Unit 4. A few minutes passed, and at that moment, I felt completely alone. Fear and adrenaline taking over again, even though I was exhausted then. Finally, a response. First, it came out extremely distorted and broken up, so I placed my ear closer to the speaker. This is Control. Get out of my house. A womanly voice interrupts the speaker. It was like a whisper, but clear enough to be heard. I dropped the radio, nearly breaking it, and stepped back. But then I got a much clearer. This is Control. I grabbed the radio again reluctantly and explained to them what just happened. They then asked me a question that made everything seem surreal, like I knew nothing about the world. It was then I knew God was not real, and there was so much more to this world than most of us know. Would the situation be classed as paranormal? In my stunned, dazed state, I asked them to repeat, would you say the things you have seen are unexplainable? I then said without thinking, yes, over. They responded, copy that. A paranormal team will be sent to your location shortly. Please remain calm. She said this with ease, like this was a normal occurrence for them. When I explained to her, I thought she would think I'd gone crazy. But no. She knew from what I had said that it was a paranormal situation, making the rumor true, that the team is real. I stayed in that room, curled up in a ball against the corner like a child would do when their parents are fighting, praying for it to end soon. Minutes more passed and I could hear banging on the bedroom door again. Suddenly shouting erupted from downstairs. How could you do this to our baby, you monster? It was a woman, and a distraught, manic one at that. She howled with sheer anger, to which a man replied, Darling, it was the maid's fault. She should have been watching her. He sounded very prim and proper. You were fornicating with her again. I know you were. You left our baby all alone upstairs, left to suffocate in her cot all because you couldn't help yourself. You selfish, stupid man. The voice was maddening at this point, just purely primal, and hysterical tones. Darling, put that down. You don't want to do that. I know you love me. We can work this out. Crashing, banging, and smashing is all I heard for a minute straight, even with my hands up to my ears to block out the noise. When it all stopped, a sound came from downstairs. The woman was humming, London Bridge is falling down. A pain radiated from the sound, affecting anything nearby with its emotion, and for the first time in years, I cried uncontrollably. The humming slowly got closer to me. I could hear her walking up the stairs, the creaks of the floorboards giving away her location. I held my breath as I knew she had reached the bedroom door, still humming. The door handle was being tried, but there was no way it could get through, surely. Even with the certainty, I shut my eyes, not wanting to look anymore, and retreated to the darkness of my brain. Silence fell for a while, and then to my utter horror, a hushed voice spoke close to my ear, its cold breath lathering my neck, causing the hairs to stand. My fair lady. I cried even harder in pure hysterical fear. I felt her bony, cold hands on my face brushing up and down, wiping off the tears, though I still dare not open my eyes, for who knew what I was to see. Then, like the gates of heaven had opened to accept me as one of their own, the door downstairs crashed open, followed by shouts of, "Police! Police!" Running pounded up the stairs, and the thing next to me whispered in my ears, "Don't worry, little one. Mommy will be with you. Mommy will always love you." The door to the bedroom smashed open, and people with flashlights, large guns, and priests with sage burning in their hands entered the room, allowing me to finally open my eyes. My mind went blank after that, and I woke up in a hospital a few days later. Apparently my body put me into a short coma due to extreme induced shock. It should have no effect on my body, but shock like that will almost certainly leave PTSD. Not long after, I was awake. I was approached by some very shady characters flashing me an FBI badge. They said what I had seen can never be spoken about again for my family's sake, and that the team that you heard about does not exist. I had to sign an NDA, and was told to move on as if nothing happened, but every time I try to sleep, I hear her, feel her, sense her, and when I wake up in a cold sweat, her final voice rattles my brain. "Don't worry, little one. Mommy will be with you. Mommy will always love you." We arrived at the venue approximately 30 minutes late. I wasn't expecting much, truthfully. I wasn't a huge fan of the bride and projected those feelings onto the wedding. Secretly, I wanted it to suck, but I didn't expect it to go this badly. We checked into our room and Andre and I settled in. I unpacked my makeup in preparation for tomorrow, and he cracked open a light beer. Andre was a groomsman, and we had 2 hours before we had to leave for the rehearsal dinner. We spent it watching trash TV while getting trashed on a stockpile of light beer. Basically, we were prepping for a normal weekend. Something didn't feel quite right to me though. I've always been sensitive, but I've never been in the middle of a situation I didn't have control of. I wandered across the hall in search of medicine to settle my nerves. I knew that Rebecca would have some, but she was nowhere to be found. Her boyfriend had last seen her 45 minutes ago, and he assumed she went to her family's lake house that was just down the road. I expected that the beer would have to settle my nerves, and I wandered back to my room. The night before the wedding went off without a hitch throughout the rehearsal, and the rehearsal dinner. We all partied until about 2 a.m., and I, for a moment, forgot my overwhelming feeling that something wasn't right. The wedding was beautiful. It was small, in the mountains of New Hampshire, with perfect decorations and delicious food. Rebecca had reappeared just before the ceremony, but she seemed a little off, usually impeccably polished. She was tripping over cornhole boards and twirling until she fell in the middle of the dance floor. She hadn't had anything to drink, so I chalked her inhibitions up to drugs. There really was no other explanation at the time, but I'd soon find myself to be very, very wrong. We all went back to the hotel and made our way down to the hotel bar. Most were stumbling there, but were still served regardless. Rebecca loomed in the corner watching us, rising the hair on the back of my neck. I went out onto the deck with Andre and Dave, and we smoked. We recounted the events of the night, and I decided to head to bed knowing I had chips in the room waiting for me. And, truthfully, wanting to get away from Rebecca's gaze, expecting Andre to follow closely behind. I tucked myself in, chips resting on my chest while watching trash TV once again. Suddenly I heard a loud crash outside the room. All my senses urged me to stay in bed with the door locked. My brain screamed that this would be surefire safety, but my curiosity took over and I padded my way to the door, taking care to be as quiet as possible. I first peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. I undid the lock carefully and opened the door just a crack. Suddenly something slammed into the door, launching me across the room. As my world spun, I recognized Mac, standing in the doorway looking absolutely feral. My brain ceased to work and my body took over, launching myself into the bathroom and locking the door. I didn't hear anything. I expected Mac to enter the room, but instead my ears met absolute silence. No footsteps, no breathing. The only thing I could hear was my own rapid heartbeat. "Gemma, can I come in?" I heard Mac ask. I didn't respond. Still too overcome with fear, my voice simply couldn't work. I kept thinking no, and somehow it seemed like he got the hint. He didn't ask again, and I still heard nothing. He didn't enter. An hour or so passed before I was able to bring myself to exit the bathroom. As soon as I did, my ears were assaulted with noises of what was going on in the rest of the hotel. Screams, the crashing of furniture meeting walls, doors slamming open. It sounded like all hell was breaking loose. None of the sounds seemed close by, though, so I assumed the rampage had already made its way through my part of the hotel. I pulled out my phone, but it had been smashed when Mac had thrown me across the room. I've always been one to explore, so I decided to take the chance and venture out of my room, against all of my better judgment. As soon as I entered the hall, all I saw was bright red. Blood painted the walls as if they'd lined up an entire battalion and executed them by fire right there in the hallway. To my right there was an exit, and to my left there was almost guaranteed carnage. But Andre still hadn't come back, and I couldn't bring myself to leave without him. I ventured left. I'd only walked about 50 yards when I first heard the hissing. Every time I spun around, it would stop abruptly. I knew immediately that I was being hunted, but I still did not know by what. I finally reached the bar where everyone had just been having fun. Right as I entered the room, Mac reappeared again, stepping out from behind me, the door into the doorway and blocking my exit. He was splattered in blood, staring menacingly at me as a chilling grin spread across his face. I scanned for exits and remembered the balcony. Knowing my choices were run or die, I ran. I exploded through the balcony doors, jumping off the edge. No one followed, but I could feel Mac watching me as I peeled myself off the ground, adrenaline forcing my muscles to work, and turned the corner of the building out of his sight. Right as I turned the corner, I collided with something cold and hard head first. On the ground, clutching my forehead and feeling the blood pool in my hand, I looked up to see Mike staring down at me with the same menacing grin Mac had just been wearing in the bar. I saw no way out, but suddenly I heard snarling. Mike's gaze turned from me to the sound, and before I could even blink, he vanished. Knowing that if even Mike ran from the noise, I should too. I headed back to the hotel. Every hall seemed to be painted in bright, red, fresh blood. The screams had ceased, but the crashing had not. I reimagined when Mac had broken into my room but hadn't breached the doorway. I knew I had to go back there, to safety. I summoned all my strength and hoped to run, but instead hobbled down the hall to the stairway. I climbed the 3 flights slower than I'd hoped, my vision growing blurrier with each passing moment, but managed to get to my floor. I slowly cracked the door from the stairs to the hall, but was flung back yet again by someone bursting through, with less force this time. Andre was there, looking terrified. I knew whatever had gotten to the others had gotten to him. His eyes floated to me, but instead of coming to me, he ran up the stairs to the next floor. I heard the door bang behind him and knew I was alone once again. I sat in shock, scanning my brain for the next move. I wanted to follow Andre, but a feeling in my stomach told me that if I did, I'd be dead. So far, I'd ignored my instincts, and I wasn't going to let that happen again. I made my way to my room instead, and when I arrived, I quietly shut the door behind me, hoping that this was just a dream and I'd wake up soon. Somehow knowing that wasn't the case. I sat straining to hear anything, but all had fallen quiet. Eventually, after a few hours had passed, I heard footsteps. As they drew closer, the hissing began to ring within my ears, and I knew I had to move away from the door. Just as I flopped over, the door shot open, and there was the bride covered in blood, snarling, eyes wide and crazy, looking around the room and then directly at me. In the most sickly sweet voice, she said, "Gemma, may I come in?" I just stared, and after a beat simply shook my head to indicate no. Louder, she asked again. I felt something come over me, urging me to invite her in, but resisted, knowing that doing so would only spell disaster. I continued to try, and with each ask it became harder and harder to say no. Just as I was finally about to crack and say yes, I noticed a distinct orange light begin to creep across the floor, and when I looked up to the doorway, the bride was gone. I knew I only had a moment to get out. My body didn't want to respond when I urged it to move, but somehow I got up, grabbed the keys, leaving all my belongings behind, and mustered the courage to run toward the stairwell. Just as I exited the room, I felt myself get pushed into the wall. Dazed, I searched for who had hit me, and saw the bride with the same crazed look in her eyes approaching me, stopping just short of the encroaching orange light that was now pouring out of my hotel room door. She turned to close the door, and I took the opportunity to get myself into the stairwell, rolling down the stairs in hopes of not getting incapacitated. She seemed to appear right next to me as I reached the bottom floor. She lunged at me and I flailed my legs, kicking the door to the outside open, bathing her in the morning light. She screamed and lunged out of the light, but it was too late. Blisters erupted on her skin, and as they spread, they turned to ash. Within moments, instead of a crazed bride, there was just a blood-splattered wedding gown covering a pile of ash on the floor. I rolled out through the door to bask in the growing sunlight. I rested, knowing I was safe, before eventually getting in the car and driving off. Head still spinning, not even thinking to check on Andre, somehow knowing that he couldn't come with me and would not have made it through the night. The news chalked the massacre that continued that night to a mass shooting by a disgruntled wedding guest. I moved away from the East Coast to find a new life, but some nights I hear a knock on my door and hear Andre's voice pleading for me to let him in. I still remember catching the faintest traces of an off smell when we first stepped foot in the new house. It wasn't particularly of note at the time, mostly blending into the base notes of ancient wood, dry, chipped paint, and a general old house aroma. And the scent wasn't just for show either, as the house had been built in the early 1900s. Its completion arising just a couple of years before America was struck in the backhand by the Great Depression. Those little history tidbits were the main things on my mind as Sharon and I looked over the living space from the open front door on that first day at the house in May. Yet, I still took note of the off smell, packing the memory away for a later date, even if for the briefest of moments. It would be a long time before I would recall that first instance, that half second where I felt something was off, felt unease. It would be longer still before I would come to know the origin of the scent, and pray to God every night thereafter that I could erase it from my mind, along with the memories it conjures. But it's a hard miracle to truly erase the smell of death. Our new home used to be a farmhouse, set up in one of West Virginia's rural valleys straddling the edge of the Appalachians. I'd received a new job opportunity with a much higher pay rate, and in addition, it would be a remote position allowing me to work from anywhere I wanted. Of course, it ended up being where Sharon wanted, which was up east where her family was situated. That didn't bother me. I can't stand my family, so the further away from them, the better. All that being said, the main reason for taking the job wasn't the freedom I'd gain, or the scenic views, but rather was primarily due to us being due. Our first child was well on the way, and we found out only a couple of weeks before the job offer made its way to me. Seemed a smart decision to get a pay raise and be able to pick whatever environment I wanted to raise a kid in. What kid wouldn't want to grow up on a farm? Granted, this place wasn't really a farm. Not anymore. A lot of the farmland had been sectioned off and sold as separate properties since the plot's heyday, leaving a space that was more of a glorified backyard than anything. But I still had to admit that it was pretty cool to be right on the edge of the valley, planted at the base of one of the larger peaks surrounding the nearby town. Dreary. The locals called it Mount Echo, but most maps don't name it, and the place has apparently had its share of folklore attributed it, though I'm not much one for reading folklore, much less believing in it. We settled in pretty fast, Sharon, Steve, and I, and it didn't even take too long to accumulate to the altitude. Steve, our orange tabby, threw up once or twice in the first couple days, but he has a tendency to overeat, so it could have just been that. Having moved in towards the beginning of summer, the weather was pretty much all you could ask for, and nothing like the humid, southwestern heat I was accustomed to. It was due in part to the warmer weather that it would be some time before I'd start to notice the stranger things about the house again, that my memory of the off smell would arise, and I would be made uneasy again. Sharon was due in January, and was showing strong by mid-fall. It had started to get cold outside, especially at night, and like the summer's mild temperatures, this chill was not what I was accustomed to. The last thing I wanted was for my wife and unborn child to freeze to death, but as it turned out, the home didn't have the most functional modern heating system. I would have to go into town and purchase firewood, as the primary heater source in the one-story home was the fireplace situated in the main living room. It was an odd fireplace, which didn't occur to me in full until I stood before it, an armful of oak in my grasp. Firstly, the fireplace wasn't against a wall, but rather jutted out from the center of the floor. It was like a brick and mortar support column in the middle of the room, that just so happened to have a stove at the bottom. In fact, the chamber was odd enough in and of itself. For one, it was much smaller than most fireplaces I'd seen, especially for the time period it was built. But for two, it was generally crude in make, the more so when compared to the craftsmanship of the rest of the house. Not to say that the place was a mansion, or to say that either the fireplace or the house were inherently terrible looking when accounting for their age. It was more that they just felt different, incompatible, and if some other home had lost a fire pit and misplaced it in this one. Not that this would stop me from burning the oak logs. The faintest beginnings of the weird tingling feeling of unease creeping in as I lowered myself towards it. That was another thing. The lowering. The fireplace was rather small and close to the ground, requiring me to lean over in order to open the door to the chamber. Doing so resulted in a metallic creak, which I couldn't be sure if I should attribute to my back or the chamber door. That thought subsided quickly as I froze. The off smell shot through my nose clear as day. Clearer than on that first day when the other scents masked it so effectively. It was like I'd opened the floodgates, and I came to the quick realization that it was not a pleasant smell. I dropped one of the logs, trying to reach up and cover part of my nose with a mitten-wrapped hand. The odor had taken me by surprise, and I couldn't place what it was. It didn't smell like any wood or ash I'd ever seen burned. Sitting the oak pile off to the side, I leaned forwards to the open door. Although it was a small space, I could just barely fit part of my head inside the chamber. The smell was the strongest I had ever noticed it in here. It was then that I noticed a much more bizarre oddity of the fireplace. It wasn't on the ground. The base of the chamber wasn't concrete or steel or iron, but rather some sort of shaft. It was covered by a metal grate with holes big enough to stick a finger through, but sturdy enough to hold a pile of logs. The chimney in our house went down into darkness. My instinct would have been if it was some sort of tray or disposal for the ashes from the fire, but that was far too deep for that to make sense. Reaching into the pile, I snapped off a wood chip, chopping it down through one of the holes in the grate, and for a moment in the void, I heard it hit the bottom. The shaft had to be almost 15 feet down. I jerked back at the much louder sound coming from below, smacking the back of my head on the edge of the chamber as I stumbled back onto the ground next to my firewood. I just laid there for a moment, allowing my head to spin. Maybe there was an old basement down there or something. Maybe a squirrel had fallen down there or something. Maybe I didn't want to think about any more somethings that could be down there. I packed up my oak and tossed it onto the grate from a safe distance and flicked a match over it. The fire did its job. By the time night rolled around, Sharon and I were nice and warm, caressed by the heat as we watched some low-budget thriller before bed, Steve taking turns between our laps. When time came to retire for the evening, I'd mostly forgotten about the strange sound and bottomless fireplace. Even when the hints of that off smell mingled with the puff of smoke spawned from putting out the fire, I still felt uneasy when I laid in bed across from Sharon that night. But I chalked it up to cheap pizza and the fact we'd just watched a 2-hour movie about some guy who ate people. The next morning I'd toss out the old wood, toss in the new, and I would even stick my sore head into the chamber for a whiff. At least, that was my plan. It wasn't quite how things actually went. Since it was a weekend, I wasn't too concerned with waking up early, so it was nearly 10 before I slunk out of bed, making my way into the living room. I put on a pot of coffee one of Sharon's aunts had gifted me for my birthday the month before, then shuffled towards the fireplace, hoping I'd have the caffeine ready by the time I was done disposing of the oak. I leaned down, rubbing my eyes with one hand as I reached out mid-yawn to open the chamber door with the other. But after the yawn completed, my mouth still hung slightly ajar. The fireplace was empty, no wood to be seen, just a thin layer of white ash dusting the top of the grate. Certainly Sharon hadn't gotten up and taken it out. I seriously doubted she'd be able to lean down in order to reach in and remove the log at her current size. And yet, it was gone. After staring a moment, I stuck my hand into the chamber, gripped the grate by my fingers, and pulled up slightly. It popped cleanly out of place. Rather than being secured in any meaningful way, the iron simply rested on a 1/4-inch protrusion of brick running around the edge of the chimney. Surely it didn't dislodge itself as the burnt logs cracked and broke, did it? I couldn't imagine the grate having come loose enough to both allow the oak to slip through without the grate itself shuttering down the chamber as well. Not to mention that the crash would have awoken at least one of us, and maybe the cat. The tendrils of the off smell hit me and I quickly put the grate back onto the ledge and stepped away. At least the coffee smelled good. I didn't say anything to Sharon about the fireplace or the wood disappearing, as she was typically more spooked by stuff like that than I would be. Better not to let her know, especially with the stress of the baby. She was all in on the panic mode preparations throughout the fall, when I'd wake up in the middle of the night with bad dreams about the endless chasm beneath our new house, and the hints of rotten off smell penetrating our bedroom door. She was awoken with nightmares about strollers, diapers, and what color to paint the baby's room. I chalked my own nerves up to the fears associated with being a new father. I was using my unease about the house to mask my confrontation with what I was actually afraid of. Becoming like my parents. It was something I needed to face, and it had hit me at random times, so I'd use random things to mask it. I convinced myself of the sounds in the fireplace on at least 2 other occasions. Maybe it was in my head. Maybe it wasn't. I still didn't tell Sharon. A couple of weeks went by and we were browsing for the baby's room at a hardware store, trying to find the right lighting. I discreetly threw some bolt screws and new driver for them in with the rest of the haul. When Sharon was out of the house grabbing dinner, I moved to the fireplace, drilling the grate down into the ledge. I tested it with my fingers and the hold was solid. If there was something down there, squirrel, raccoon, bird, you name it, that thing was staying down there, along with my fears about parenthood. Sealed up, locked away, key discarded. Around Christmas was when we lost Steve. That changed things. We just couldn't find him, and we spent 2 days searching the property with no traces, which was odd. Steve wasn't a wandering cat. He was getting on up there in age, and his favorite activities primarily consisted of sitting, sleeping, and laying in the sun. Sharon was pretty broken up about it, which I didn't need. It was her who had insisted on adopting the old geezer while we were dating, and she was all worried that it was a reflection on how well we'd do in January. And imagine if that happened with the baby and blah blah blah. I needed her to zip up that wound fast because my stitches weren't going to hold long under the scrutiny of her emotional response. I needed to find the cat, dead or alive, give her some kind of closure. Otherwise, I'd have to admit I was scared shitless about being a dad too. That was what led me back to the chimney. Once the thought cropped up, I just had to know. Had to be sure. I knelt down by the chamber door and swung it open. There was nothing there, of course, save ash. But as I began to swing the door shut, I noticed the bolts had been removed from the grate. I reached in and pulled it out, staring down into the abyss, before shifting my eyes upward to the patch of dark red stain on the sides of the brick. Right below where the grate sat, dried blood. No question about it. I pulled back and stood in front of the fireplace, grate still in my grip. Nothing could convince me the bloodstain wasn't from Steve. I wanted to say he somehow found a way to get through on his own. Slipped, maybe. An accident, but no, I knew that wasn't it. There was no way past the grate. Then I noticed. On the mantel above the chamber, there were the 4 screws, lined up like little soldiers in a neat row, threads stripped smooth, bits of torn metal hanging loose from their sides, but nowhere on the top outside of from the initial installation. They hadn't been removed by a tool. They had been ripped out by hand. The hand that took Steve. But it was Christmas, and the baby would be here in a month. I still didn't tell Sharon about the chimney. Some collected fur scraps from Steve's old bed, and a bit of rehydrated blood that I found out back was convincing enough. We put a little cross in the yard for him, a grave with no body. Our family of 2 celebrated Christmas alone. Without Sharon's knowledge, I gave the real estate office a call, inquiring about some curiosities with our floor plan. My hope was to learn a little bit about the history of the place, primarily the chimney, and I got more than I initially bargained for. During the Depression, a family of 3 lived in the house. At the time, it was a 2-story occupied by a father, mother, and their daughter, who was only a toddler. Near the end of the 20s, a landslide occurred on the valley side of Mount Echo, one of the worst in state history. The first floor of the house was completely engulfed, and almost collapsed, buried under rock, dirt, and wood. It took over a week before the terrain was safe enough to get to the house from town. It took longer before anybody even started looking. Most people assumed the family was inside, at least that's what people said. There was no way to get into the first floor save blowing a hole in the second, and anybody down there would have been dead by the time any fool had bothered to check on them. No bodies were ever recovered, but the family wasn't seen or heard from again after that. Eventually the land got bought, and the caved-in stairwell was sealed up. The chimney opened up on the second floor and given a fireplace, and the house was renovated and sold. Supposedly the property had some history with the town folklore after that point, but the real estate agent was clear on the details. I'd heard enough, so I went home, wishing I'd heard less, and consigned to try and forget most of it. In January, I became a father. Only 2 days off schedule, a beautiful baby girl. We named Astrid after one of Sharon's relatives who helped us out financially early on. She was one of the few, as my parents were too busy disapproving of my life. It was hard to look in Astrid's eyes, imagining she could think the same thing about me one day, if I wasn't careful. After all, I was already picking up my own father's habits of lies and secrecy. The chimney, the fireplace, the grate, the cat, the folklore, all of it was weighing on my shoulders like this load I couldn't shake. None of it had I told Sharon, and yet she was starting to notice anyway. Notice that something was wrong with me, in the way I'd turn away, or half smile, or go these long periods without talking. She probably thought after the baby came it'd go away, that it was just nerves, but no, it was worse. I didn't feel as much joy as I should have from taking care of Astrid. I was filled only with dread. Dread that in the night that dark black hand would reach out from the chasm beneath the chimney and snatch me up, pulling me into the depths, only to find that the monster was myself, the failed father I was destined to become. It was just genetics, inevitability. Eventually, a few weeks after we took Astrid home, Sharon decided it would be a good time to talk to me about it. Granted, she didn't actually know what it was she was trying to talk to me about at first, but I'm sure she had her suspicions. I thought I'd be able to play it off, keep her off the trail of my fears, but then she just had to fracture the thin veil that was keeping me at bay, reaching out to place a hand on my shoulder, which I promptly refused. David, come on. You don't. You aren't going to be like them. I broke. How do you know? We fought, went to bed on opposite sides, quiet and indignant. I couldn't keep myself under control. The black hand of dread had already snatched me up, and it had done so long before, when I wasn't paying attention. Now I was stuck, toying with the hooks it had set in me, ripping flesh out with them. I cried silently and alone as Sharon slept. Eventually I sat up in bed, unable to sleep with myself, or with the knowledge that I was bringing the very fear of dysfunction that had kept me up in nights past to life, simply though the worry of their existence. I nearly vomited into the floor, sick to my stomach, needed to calm my nerves. But then I realized it wasn't the nerves that were bringing on my nausea. I stood beside the bed frame, suddenly alert. It wasn't the nerves at all. It was the smell. I wasn't sure why, but I instinctively grabbed the only firearm we owned, a Mossberg 59081, pumped shotgun, and marched towards Astrid's room. The off smell grew in intensity the closer I got. My entire body froze a few paces away. The smell was stronger than I'd ever encountered it to be, and I could barely keep my senses in order. But that wasn't what stopped me. I could hear Astrid giggling, and there was something else. A second voice, or something like a voice. It was low, hard to make out, and indecipherable. I pumped the shotgun. Taking short, careful steps, I narrowed the gap between myself and the shut bedroom door. I found myself filled with fear, the black hand of my future self gripping me by the throat. I reached out, ready to take a peek through the door. She was probably just in her crib, maybe hungry. What would Sharon think if she saw me here with this gun? Maybe she'd think I really was like my dad. Maybe she always thought that and just never said it. I turned the door handle. Before I could think, the door slammed open towards me. Busting off its hinges, hit square in the face, I was thrown back onto the ground, my head banging into the hardwood as the splintered door fell against the opposite wall. My mind was spinning, warm blood gushing out of my nose, the taste of iron filling my mouth as the stream dipped between my lips and teeth. Opening my eyes, I saw one of the hinge screws roll across the floor a few inches from my face. The threads were stripped. I bolted up straight just in time to see it. Thin, blackened, dirty, and long. I only caught a glimpse of the thing's legs as it turned the hallway corner into the living room. The giggling went with it. It was like a man on all fours, but it was not a man. I stood, dizzy, and ran as best as I could towards the living room. My knees were hurting. I looked down to see a thin piece of wood from the door jutting out of my lower thigh. No time. I turned the corner into the living room to see the iron grate fly across the room and into the couch. My head flicked in the direction of the chimney. The black hands of dread were pulling my daughter into the fireplace. She was enjoying the ride, but she was just a baby. I drew the gun as she reached for me. There wasn't a shot. I'd hit her. Astrid and the creature disappeared over the ledge, vanishing in the chasm beneath the fireplace. Astrid! I screamed in anguish, head still pounding from being hit by a door. What was I supposed to do? The door to the master bedroom slammed open. Sharon walked out half asleep. David, what are you doing? Why do you have the gun? I wanted to sit and explain it to her like I should have before. I should have told her everything. The chimney, the grate, the cat, the dread. She deserved to know about the fear, about the destiny, and I decided right then and there that she would. But first, I needed to make sure that destiny didn't come true. Aiming at the floor, I began blowing holes in the hardwood with the Mossberg. This prompted Sharon to scream. She begged me to stop, but I wasn't thinking straight. I was thinking straight for the first time in a while. Stopping my volley, I turned to face her. Honey, I need you to trust me. Then the floor caved in, and I fell into the dark. I landed awkwardly, rolling onto my back and struggling to stand as Sharon called my name through the holes in the ceiling. There was flashlight on the end of the Mossberg, which I clicked to life. Broken boards, shattered glass, piles of dirt, rocks, and debris. I was standing on the building's original first floor, the walls splintered, caving inwards. It was barely navigatable. Behind me came a sound that could only be Astrid's. I moved through the debris, making my way through the broken home towards the sounds. Rounding a corner, I found myself in what must have been the original master bedroom, except the bed was now rotten and covered in muck. Inadvertently, I choked, and found that stomach acid was spilling from my mouth and onto the ground. I threw up. The off smell was dizzying in this room. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled. As I wiped the spit and vomit from my lips, I pulled up the Mossberg to realize where the origin of the smell was. Embedded deep within the rotting and stained fibers of the bed sheets were the remains of two people. nearly unrecognizable as something that could have been human. What clothes were left on them were clearly from another time period, and decayed beyond belief. The bodies themselves had practically melted, though far meatier than one would expect bodies from the 20s to be, likely due to lack of airflow. But more than all that, there were chunks missing, some as though they'd been almost surgically cut off, others as if they were bitten. My jaw was agape when I heard the noise again, the one that sounded something like a man but wasn't. It came from the direction of what I assumed was once a closet. Pumping the shotgun, no longer certain of how many shots I had left, I approached the closet doorway. There would be no hesitation this time. I spun around the corner to see that the room had been hollowed out. It was much bigger now than it ever had been as a closet. Something had clawed away at the walls, hollowing out an enclave in the dirt behind it, almost like a small cave or tunnel. Astrid giggled. I aimed down to see her laying there in the floor. Relief flushed through me, as she appeared to be all right. Dropping down instantly and setting aside the shotgun, I scooped her up, tears welling. I wasn't going to lose her. I wasn't going to be any less than the father I always wanted. I could be more than my dread. For her and for Sharon, I had to be. Pulling her close to my chest with one arm, I grabbed the Mossberg in the other and stood. And that's when I heard that sound again. I pointed the barrel up to see a half glimpse of its face before I pulled the trigger. It was monstrously thin, with broken teeth, frayed hair, and eyes like little black dots sunken abysmally far into its head. And on top, a decayed piece of clothing. Almost. The blast erupted from the shotgun, throwing my arm back. The creature hissed and hollered in searing pain. Reeling from the kickback of firing a shotgun single-handed while holding a baby, my grip slipped and I lost the gun in the shadows. Astrid stopped giggling as I ran. She must not have liked the sound of a Mossberg going off a few inches from her face. Her cries rang through the collapsed building as I attempted to navigate through the dark. I had to get her out. At some point, I started to realize I was no longer on the first floor. The creature had dug tunnels out of the house, clawing a whole system into the dirt beneath the property. I prayed to God that there was a way out. Then I prayed that the man-thing not catch up to us before we found it. My mind wandered as my legs grew tired. I'd forgotten about the piece of door still jutting from one of them. I remembered a photo the real estate agent had shown me in an old newspaper clipping of the family that died. I started to limp. I could hear water running up ahead. Was the daughter wearing a bonnet? I couldn't catch my breath. Could we end up like them? I needed to make it to the water. We won't end up like them. We burst into the moonlight, straddling up to the edge of a creek where the tunnel led out. The thing from the chimney must have used it as a water source. It was still pretty dark, and my legs were all but useless, but I walked anyway. By the time we got back to the house, it was almost dawn. It felt like ages since I dropped through the floor, but in actuality, it was barely 20 minutes. Sharon had called the police, but they hadn't arrived yet. She was pissed, threatening to divorce me, to turn me in, but it was just nerves. I sat her down and I cried and I tore the veil. I told her everything. The chimney, the grate, the cat, the real estate agent, the tunnels, and the bonnet. Half of it she believed, half of it she didn't. But she knew that I didn't try to hurt Astrid. She knew that I believed it, and she knew my dread was real even if the monster in our basement wasn't. When the police did pull up to the house, we told them I'd just fallen through a bit of structurally unsound floor, but that I got out on my own and everything was okay now. They thought that was odd, but they shrugged and helped me patch up my leg. One asked about the D-hinge door on the way out. I told him we were doing renovations. Sharon and I talked for a long time that day, about things that we hadn't openly discussed in a long time. We talked a lot the next day too, and many times in the weeks that would come. We started taking steps towards the parents we wanted to be. One of those steps was renting an apartment in Dreary. Well, we renovated the floor and sold the farmhouse. We needed a second fresh start, one not driven by a desire to run away from the past, but rather by the desire to forge a better future. And maybe a house that didn't have any secret rooms or basements. I guess I started to believe in a bit of folklore after all, mainly because there is some truth to most legends. It's just that what they don't tell you is that the true parts are the ones you make true for yourself. I know that now. I'm more than my dread. Most of us are. I drink quite heavily these days. I drink until I feel, then I keep drinking until I stop feeling. My days are such horribly depressing messes that seem to drag endlessly. I don't know how I'll get out of this mess. Let me tell you how it got to this point, I guess. Quite recently, my father died. I hadn't spoken to him in several years prior to his death. We weren't on good terms. He had apparently shot himself in the head with his hunting rifle, which, as much as I disliked him, I couldn't help but feel sad about. I'd also struggled with depression and alcoholism for a long time, part of the reason why I grew so distant from my father. To my surprise, he did leave something for me in his will. It was a bar that he owned. That's when I knew that he really did still hate me. As a kid, I was completely terrified of that bar. It was an old place, must have been at least 100 years old, built out of wood. It used to scare me so much because the place was so quiet, so dimly lit, and barely any customers showed up. Cleaning up after closing hours was such a nightmare. It barely helped that my older brothers used to tell me scary stories about that place. So there was this serial killer that owned this place a long time ago. I remember my older brother Jack telling me, during the day, he worked the counter, then at night he'd bring back women to it and kill them with an axe, then he'd bury them underneath the floorboards. They say that if you're there by yourself, you can hear his victims crying. So many nights filled with horrible dreams about that place. I chuckled. My father must have had a dark sense of humor. I decided that I had moved to my hometown. My life wasn't going anywhere at the moment anyway, and this might have been the break that I'd needed. A few weeks later, I'd moved. The building had a room with a bed behind the counter, so I could just sleep there. Business went fine for a while. It wasn't a very big town, so there weren't many bars in the area. A lot of people came to mine. For a few months, it was a comfortable existence. Not perfect, but I could live like this. Of course, it didn't last. One night, after closing, I was up cleaning the bar. The place had so much dust everywhere that some of these things must not have been cleaned in at least a decade. As I was cleaning, I pulled the rug that was behind the counter to wash the floor, and that's when I first saw it. It was an old wooden latch. Nothing remarkable about it. The handles on it were incredibly rusted. It had been there for a really long time. Despite all the time I'd spent in that bar as a kid, I never knew about this. I figured that it must have been a cellar or maybe a crawl space underneath there. The memory of Jack's story flooded my mind again as my hands touched and grabbed the handles. I shook my head and I pried it open. The handles also felt incredibly rusted. Underneath the hatch, there was a long dark hole with a circle of bricks surrounding it. It was a well. It must have been older than the bar, and they'd just built over it without covering it. But that didn't explain why there was a hatch over it. I looked down into the darkness of the well, cold air rising up. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Cold air shouldn't still rise up like that, yet I could feel the entire room get chillier. I probably should have just closed it then and there, but I turned on my phone's flashlight to see if I could make out the water. At the very bottom of the well, there was a dead body floating in the water. It was a naked woman with long black hair, her skin the color of paper. It didn't look like the body had been there for long. Holy fuck, I muttered to myself as I backed away from the hole. How did that get in there? My father had died months ago. That body didn't look like it could have been older than a few days. I had to call the cops. As I was about to dial the number, I heard it. It was an ever so soft whispering sound. At first, I thought I imagined hearing it, but it kept going. The story from my childhood flooded my mind again. I leaned over the well and, indeed, that's where the sound was coming from. I'm so cold. A soft, broken voice echoed from the well. So cold. I recoiled backwards in horror. That voice was not human. It almost sounded human, but not quite. I didn't know how to react. It wasn't right. I shone my phone's flashlight down there again, and it was indeed the woman that was talking. So cold. So much pain. Can you come down here, please? She said. I shut the hatch open after that. I sat down on one of the wooden chairs of the bar. I didn't really know what to do. I was in shock and denial over the entire ordeal. I turned to the only thing I knew, which was alcohol. So I picked up a bottle of whiskey and took a few shots. The whimpering sounds continued for the entire time. I woke up the next day with a headache. I didn't even remember falling asleep. I opened up the bar and went about business as usual. What had happened the previous night was troubling me the entire time, but I just didn't show it. After closing, I braced myself and I opened up the hatch again. The whimpering noises started the moment I opened it. I sat down by the mouth of the well for a while, just listening to that woman tell me how cold it was down there, and how she wanted me to come there with her. I must have sat there for a few hours at least, mesmerized by the situation. The tone of her voice went from several kinds of pain to sadness to apathy and so on, trying every tactic possible to get me down there. There was something so incredibly hypnotizing about the entire thing. In spite of how terrifying it was, the voice was attracting me. Despite the fact that this couldn't have been happening in the first place, I was still thinking logically at least. I had to do something about this. Things like these should not exist in our world. Who knows what would have happened if I did go down there? But I wasn't going to find out. I closed the hatch again that night and drank myself to sleep again. The next day after closing, I opened the hatch yet again. As expected, the soft whimpering started once more. I was starting to get sick of this entire situation. I wasn't going to let this take over my life, bring me down into that place of depression and misery again. "What the hell are you?" I asked, looking down into the well, my speech ever so slightly slurred from drinking. "So cold. Why don't you climb down here with me?" she painfully managed to say. That voice, ever so slightly not human. It wasn't something that was of this world. Whatever it was, I was going to send it back to wherever it came from. I was going to pour gasoline down the well and set it on fire. There was an ever so slight change in her tone as I got up from the floor. "Scott?" the voice started. That startled me. "What?" I muttered, turning around in my tracks. "Scott, do you remember me? Your mother died in a car accident when you were 12, she said. I wanted to throw up when I heard that. "How do you know?" I asked, leaning over the well. How did it know? That was such a devastating event in my life. How could it mention it so casually? So cold. So cold. It started again. I repeated my question, but it kept pretending like it couldn't hear me. I drank some more. That night, I fell asleep with my ear to the floor, listening to that thing talk to me. Even in my dreams, I could still hear that voice. The next few days came and went just like that. I would go through my miserable day. Then after closing, I would open the hatch and listen. The woman would mostly just repeat how cold it was, but then other times, it would randomly mention traumatic events from my life. My high school girlfriend getting hit by a bus. My older brother Jack overdosing. That time I tried not being here anymore. It would say it all with an ever so slight hint that it was enjoying tormenting me. That thing isn't just not human. It was never human. It's not a murder victim like I originally thought. It knows things that it couldn't know. After a while, it seemed to have grown bored of our usual game, and it started telling me about the dark urges in my mind, telling me I should act out on them. "Why don't you kill a woman with an axe, Scott?" it said once. "Scott, why don't you want revenge?" it said another time. Over time, it kept getting more deranged in what it was asking me to do. Things that should never be said, that go beyond just violent fantasies and into the realm of knowledge that disturbs your very being. And that is how my life has been since then. I think it's getting worse. And what it's telling me, at least, there's no point in ignoring it. Even when I try to go to sleep in my room in the back, I can hear it crying in pain all night. And during my dreams, I can still hear the voice. I haven't even opened the bar in about 2 weeks. All I do is drink all day and lay down on the floor. I haven't even eaten in a few days. It's just me and that thing in here, talking to me every waking moment. I should just leave, but there's something to it that keeps drawing me in, keeps making me want to listen. No matter how much it's hurting me, I've been in some pretty severe depressions in my life before, but all of that is nothing compared to this. I really don't know what to do anymore.